Good morning, everyone. My name is Suzanne Templin, and I coordinate the webinars for Houseman Johnson Insurance. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Human Capital Management and Best Practices, presented by Kelly Lemieux. Today's webinar will run about 45 minutes, and after the webinar, we'll have a question and answer session. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free to type it into the question feature, and Kelly will address it during the Q&A portion. After the webinar is over, there will be a short survey we are hoping you can fill out for us. A note that this webinar has been certified for continuing education credits by the Society for Human Resources Management and the Human Resources Certification Institute. Details on those credits will be provided to you at the conclusion of this webinar. Also, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for review on the webinar archives of our website. If you do not want to participate in a recorded webinar, you may want to close the application at this time. You will receive a follow-up email from us later today or tomorrow with a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar. I would now like to introduce you to our presenter for today's webinar, Kelly Lemieux. Kelly is an HR technology consultant at Benefit Technology Resources. She has over 18 years of experience in the payroll and HR outsourcing industry. Kelly has implemented several of the major technology platforms, including PeopleSoft, UltiPro, and Workforce Now for the mid-market space. Just prior to joining BTR, Kelly was an implementation project manager for ADP Major Account Services for 4 years. During her time there, Kelly was recognized for her consistent implementation, exceeding 100% of the defined quarterly production plan. Kelly has held other leading implementation roles throughout her industry tenure. She has a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and we are very thankful that she could share some of her wisdom with us today. Welcome, Kelly.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Suzanne. As Suzanne mentioned today, we will discuss the human capital management technology environment and also discuss best practices. We'll talk a little bit about what is human capital management and what that means for your organization. And again, best practices. But first, I want to give you an idea of who we are as an organization. We are BTR, which stands for Benefit Technology Resources, and we are an HR consulting firm specializing in the mid-market space, and we're actually the largest consulting firm of our kind. You'll see areas here in which we specialize, primarily around the HR and payroll suite of services. One thing that I would like for you all to remember from today's presentation is that we as an organization remain provider agnostic, which means very literally that we do not take commissions from the provider community. Our business model surrounds a partnership with the independent brokerage firms. So with that in mind, it gives us an opportunity to work for the needs of the client without any influence of monetary gain. So we'll talk a little bit today about why you would consider technology. Some points listed here is that it creates, or it helps to create a standardized process along with compliance. Eliminating manual tasks is a big driver for technology considerations. Also, with a strength of a technology provider, it allows your organization to focus on the strategic HR initiatives, along with increasing the integrity of your employee data housed within the platform. The analytics piece is growing to be a stronger and stronger feature within these platforms. Analytics being dashboards and quick reporting metrics with visuals to supplement the data for executive review, rather than pulling detailed reports, converting to Excel for sorting and such. The analytics give a much prettier view of the data captured in your system. So when we talk about HCM, which stands for the Human Capital Management Suite of Services, there are a couple of different silos that you can look towards when deploying the platform. Most commonly, the tactical or the core modules are launched first, with an evolution to come forth with some additional features to supplement the technology. So here you'll see an evolution of how the platform can grow with you to best service your needs. So again, starting with that tactical or core solution oftentimes includes payroll, the HR suite of services, onboarding, time and attendance, compliance reporting, formerly known as ACA reporting, along with other general ledger reporting and such, and also accruals. Then once the core solution is deployed, you can focus on other suites of services or features within the platform. Benefits administration usually being the highest priority after the core solution has been deployed, along with recruitment, performance management, also dashboards and those analytics pieces, lead tracking as well. And then when you get to the more strategic phase of that technology partnership deployment, you can focus on some of the more supplemental features. You know, learning management, even compensation tools are becoming more and more common, as well as succession planning as well. So a staggered approach, if you will. So we'll talk a little bit about holistic platforms versus standalone or point solutions. So here are some examples of a point solution. A point solution is any standalone database that exists solely for a focused set of modules, such as HR systems, benefit administrations, any kind of applicant tracking systems. A lot of these systems can stand alone and consider themselves best in breed, rather than looking at the holistic suite, which encompasses an abbreviated version of each. So again, with a holistic solution, you're looking at payroll being a core or critical feature that must deploy first. Other modules are there and available for consumption. There's no integration needed within a holistic platform because everything is all included in one spot. It's a single database, one vendor, but you can count on them to be generalists in the additional modules outside of the core solution. Versus a point solution where they could be considered for their area of expertise a subject matter expert. It's one module, yet file integration is necessary to communicate with whatever platform you're using for, again, the core suite of services, such as payroll. It's an additional database, a plug-in. But their functionality is much more robust. When we're talking about benefit administration platforms, they're often going to include decision support, voluntary plans, defined contributions, as well as they can accommodate complex plans or any kind of wellness identifiers or credits. And here are some examples. When we talk about the holistic community, you'll see players like ADP and Paycom. And this is just a sampling. There's no subliminal messaging here as far as who is indicated to be a top provider. We just wanted to give you some logos that you might be familiar with and tie them to this holistic conversation versus the point solution. But here in the middle, you'll see Proliant and Paylocity. These are HCM or holistic solutions that integrate best-in-breed point solutions. So for example, Proliant and Paylocity happen to be resellers of the bSwift BinAdmin platform. So you're getting the best of both worlds there. And then to the right, here are some examples of those point solutions for benefits administration. PlanSource, Employee Navigator, bSwift, also Business Solver Common. When we talk about integration, there is the need, whenever a point solution is in place, again, you get the benefit of them having the subject matter expertise, but one of the things that you have to consider is an integration need with your primary or system of record, which is commonly whatever system houses your payroll and HR. So when we talk about integration, that's the data exchange between those two systems, those two platforms. And there are varying degrees of integration. Some integration is considered to just be an export and import of files, extracting data from one system, putting it into a certain file specification, and then translating it or importing it to another system. That's on the less sophisticated end of the spectrum. And there are all kinds of integration methods in between. And then the opposite end of the spectrum, the really sophisticated data exchange methodology, is an API, which is a real-time, completely hands-off integration. There's no file manipulation. There's no file pushing. An API integration is the most sophisticated real-time integration between the two platforms. That's what you want to look for, is that API capability. And oftentimes there are some considerations to make while considering a technology platform provider, if you want to go to the technology community versus doing it in-house. And here are some considerations to make. Obviously, cost is the primary factor here. How much of an investment will it take? Also, who owns the liability? Those are some considerations that you want to make. Who is going to be responsible for the tax submission? Who's going to be responsible for the reliability of the employee data, not only payroll data, time data, HR data, but also benefit enrollment data? The sophistication of the technology is also a critical factor here. Service component not to be ignored. It doesn't matter how sophisticated your technology partner is. If they don't have the service team to back it up, it's going to be a tough partnership. And then the deployment or implementation of that technology provider is certainly a considerable factor when deciding to take your manual in-house processes out to the technology environment. These implementations can oftentimes be lengthy time investments. So please just consider that and ask of your technology provider for a detailed project plan that will guide you through the deployment and implementation. Best practices during these considerations, again, when deciding to partner with a new technology provider or for the first time. First off, a detailed discovery or data exchange or knowledge transfer process is critical. The more your technology provider knows about the needs of your organization and how you operate, the better they're going to be at satisfying what you need out of that technology platform. You want to make sure that your project stakeholders are engaged and committed to the process just as much as the technology provider should be expected for the same level of engagement. Again, planning for implementation, always very critical to make sure that you understand the time commitment and also have a reasonable expectation for scope creep, knowing that there are things that can come up that maybe weren't flushed out during the discovery phase that could knock your implementation off course. So it's reasonable to expect minor things like that to happen, but just make sure that you have a conservative timeline for implementation. A post-mortem exercise is also valuable because it helps the provider to better understand how they can improve their practices. And also a reevaluation at the end. Once your technology partnership is up and running, you'll want to reevaluate what the goals were that you set forth from the very beginning to make sure that everything was accomplished. There is such a thing in this real world of implementation fatigue, so you don't want that to get in the way of your momentum. It's oftentimes common that the core solution gets implemented, then you have to get back to your day-to-day jobs, and other supplemental features like the talent management suite can be forgotten, and then you're not getting the most out of your technology partnership. So again, keep those goals in mind and reevaluate during and at the end of your implementation to make sure that everything that you set forth in the beginning has been accomplished. So during that discovery phase, here are some best practices. You'll want to identify your core objectives and whatever is painful for you in your current state. Also, you'll want to cast a wide net and do a market evaluation. So rather than going to one provider and putting all of your eggs in that provider's basket, you'll want to do an evaluation and make sure that you're getting the best sampling from the market. Also, make sure you identify the proper stakeholders within your organization. You don't necessarily want to make these decisions in a vacuum. If you have separate resources that handle different pieces of the HR pie, such as a recruiting manager, you'll want to include them when the time is right during the evaluation phase to make sure that their voices are heard and what they want out of a platform is being included. Setting a proper expectation for the investment is critical. What's really difficult is to go through a detailed evaluation phase to get to the end and get, have some element of sticker shock. So just make sure that you set a budget at the beginning and be open about your budget with any providers that you are evaluating, and make sure that they understand what the budget constraints are or how much you're willing to invest. Again, identifying any integration needs is critical. You don't want to forget about that because it can sneak up when the time comes, especially if the provider charges any additional fees for building integrations. So identify that as early on as you can. The most common integration comes when you are connecting, again, a point solution to a system of record. Integration can even apply to carrier files coming out of your benefits administration system and transmitting over directly to the carrier, thus eliminating any manual intervention for keying enrollments. So just make sure that those integration points are identified early on in the process so you can account for the cost. Also, identifying a reasonable timeline at the beginning is really helpful because it'll help keep you all on track. It'll keep the technology provider on track. Also, once a timeline has been agreed upon, a project plan henceforth would be really helpful to make sure everyone is on the same page. And again, just keep in mind that no provider is perfect. There will be challenges throughout implementation and your partnership. I would encourage that you all look to the responsiveness of that provider and how quickly they respond to those challenges and those hurdles, and focus on their recovery efforts. And just, again, remember, there's no silver bullet in this technology community. Not every provider is right for every client. So just keep that in mind when you're going through your evaluations, and remember to expect a reasonable amount of challenges to work through. Best practices indicate that the timeline, or a reasonable timeline for a request for proposal when scanning the market, is roughly 90 days. Depending on complex setup or a detailed discovery exercise, that could go towards 120 days, but 90 days should be sufficient. But then remember that once you've landed on a chosen provider, they are going to have an implementation timeline of their own that, again, can span anywhere from 60 to 120 days for the core solution, then an additional 60 to 90 days for each additional module. So again, just make sure that you have reasonable expectations when building this timeline. When it comes to engagement, you want to make sure and share the information about your organization with them. And don't be scared to dive into the weeds because the more the provider knows about your needs and expectations, the better they can marry their technology capabilities with the needs of your organization. Of course, you want to make sure that the provider has invested in the data security requirements. Most commonly, this is an SSAE 16 or 18 certification. So you'll want to ask them very explicitly, do they have these certifications? And they can show you the certificate. This is a data security exercise that requires quite an investment of time and money from the provider, but this indicates and shows how important the data integrity and security of your employee data is to them. And please don't expect all of the provider community to do all of this work for you. It will require a time investment and activity from your project stakeholders to make the implementation and the technology partnership a success. And again, partnership being the key word. You want to make sure that the technology provider is committed to fostering a climate of partnership between the two organizations, not just a tactical arrangement of housing data. And especially as you move into a finalist round, you'll want to meet with your implementers, your implementation teams and service teams and management from those two areas. Get to know them and know what their philosophy is when it comes to support and service, and make sure that that complements the culture of your organization. Now, after the evaluations are done and you have landed on a chosen provider, it's critical to evaluate their service level agreement and their contracts. You'll want to look for certain language that defines the length of the contract or the term, how long that service agreement is valid. It's common that you'll see 3 years. Some go up to 5, but 3 is the industry standard. You'll want to look for a clear definition of those discounts and how long the discounts apply. It might be referred to as an initial period or an introductory period. You'll want to look for clear termination language. What's required when terminating the partnership? Is it a 30-day notice, 60, or 90? And then when will the fees begin and how are they calculated? These are all things that you want to make sure are clearly defined in the service level agreement. So again, during implementation, the best approach is to make sure that the employee data being built within that system is reliable, clean data. Obviously, if you put bad data in, your reporting is going to be bad. If you put bad data in, your integration data is going to be compromised. So the cleaner the employee data and the corporate structure data, the more reliable the output will be. Again, it's mentioned here, insist on an implementation timeline at the start of the project. Rely on your provider to give that timeline. You'll want to take a slow and low approach to your implementation. A hasty implementation will not work for anyone, and it's very hard to recover from a hasty or abbreviated or rushed implementation. So please take your time. And remember, when testing your database, it's up to you to insist on those test transactions. The provider, from their perspective, if they test the data, it exposes any weaknesses that or inaccuracies during implementation, and it can delay implementation. But again, just remember that you'll want to test that data before going live. Test, test, test. And please don't rely on your provider to build the testing into your timeline. So when you receive that implementation timeline, make sure that there is a very conservative testing phase built in. If it is not, send it back and ask them to accommodate. Again, be prepared for the time commitment on your end and the work that it takes. And don't be afraid to make any timeline adjustments along the way. So more on this post-mortem exercise. Again, near the end of implementation, let's always go back and ask ourselves, were our requirements met? Did we achieve success? What would we have done differently? And if we've identified anything that we would have done differently, is it worth bringing to the attention of the provider so they can make enhancements for future clients and future deployments? You'll want to make sure to have a strong communication plan. Ultimately, this platform is designed to be an experience for your employees as well as your administrators. So make sure that your employees are receiving the communication necessary to properly log in, to use the system. If there are any training modules offered from the provider that are designated for your employees, take use of them and make sure your employees have time to attend those training seminars. Maybe it's in a webinar format, very similar to today's phone call, but make sure they have an opportunity to see the platform before using it for the first time. Oftentimes, the provider community has a user group or a user community, forums, if you will, where you can talk with other clients and share ideas. Take advantage of those. And then if you find yourself asking, how can you take this relationship to the next level, you can always go on site, pay them a visit. Again, meet your service teams, meet your account management teams, foster relationships with them, and get them committed to this relationship as much as you are for increased levels of support. So reevaluating. Again, at the end of your implementation, if a reevaluation is necessary, it's best to identify specific triggers that require that reevaluation. So if you've had significant growth, which impacts your bottom line or your invoicing with the provider, it's not a bad idea to reevaluate that. If you've had a spike or an extreme change in employee count, it could warrant some negotiation conversations. Keep an eye on legislative changes. We all know that the healthcare compliance climate is ever changing. Rely on your provider to help you keep your finger on the pulse of those changes. You'll want to make sure that what you set forth in the beginning when it comes to financial commitment is what you're seeing in those ongoing invoices. Make sure to tie it back to what was originally agreed upon. And again, specific timelines always can be reevaluated. Don't be shy about reevaluating your timeline and making adjustments when it makes sense for your organization. Oftentimes, there's a bit of a cultural shift required within the organization to best marry with the technology offerings. So make sure that you account for those cultural shifts. Communications to your employees and managers, especially when coming off of any kind of manual activity and then relying on technology for enhancements moving forward. And again, what we hope to cover today is a definition of the full suite of human capital management. And does that make sense for your organization? If not, what does? Maybe one of those point solutions that we talked about, a standalone vendor, a subject matter expert in areas of benefits administration, or the talent management suite. Again, best practices and making sure that you plan ahead. This is a calculated exercise and a significant investment of time and money. So please lend for plenty of time to plan for this milestone, this significant transaction for your organization. All right, so that takes us to the end. As Suzanne mentioned, there are credits that go along with this presentation today. We've wrapped up a little bit early, but the good news is that leaves plenty of time for a question and answer session. So please take note of the credits here, and I believe we can open it up for questions.
It doesn't look like we had any questions come through during the actual webinar, but if anybody would like to type in a question into the question feature of the application, please go ahead and do so. We'll hang around here for a few more minutes waiting for any questions that might come through. Okay, well, looks like we haven't really received any questions. We want to thank Kelly so much for taking the time to chat with us today. And if you do find that you have questions, please feel free to forward them on, and we'll make sure that they get to either one of our HR consultants here at Houseman Johnson Insurance or over to Kelly. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Bye, everyone.